Sometimes we encounter expressions that make us feel uneasy, even if everything seems logical at first glance. There are certain phrases, a kind of red flags, that indicate manipulation. These linguistic markers were predicted by Carl Jung, and recognizing them can be key to protecting yourself from deception. Last month, a man we'll call Pierre desperately shared his story. He discovered that he had been manipulated by his partner for 6 years. The question that plagued him was, how could he not notice the obvious signs? The answer was unexpected. Manipulators use specific phrases that bypass our critical evaluation. These phrases were identified by Jung almost a century ago. Jung found that manipulators adhere to predictable speech patterns that remain unchanged throughout human history. The most alarming thing is that these phrases can be hidden in everyday conversations that surround us everywhere. Next, we will look at 5 specific phrases that, according to Jung's analysis, are immediate alarm signals, unmistakably revealing a manipulator. Hearing them, you can immediately understand what is really happening. It is important to warn you, once you learn to recognize these patterns, you will no longer be able to ignore them. They will begin to appear everywhere, especially in the behavior of people you may have trusted. But first of all, let's understand what manipulation is from Jung's point of view. It is widely known that the vast majority of communication, namely 93%, occurs on a non-verbal level. However, practice shows that skilled manipulators use the remaining 7%, which accounts for verbal communication, with amazing accuracy. An example is the story of Sophie, one of the author's clients, a woman of outstanding intelligence who, nevertheless, repeatedly found herself drawn into destructive relationships. In the end, she realized that before exhibiting their most destructive behavior, all her partners resorted to the same phrases. It is commonly believed that manipulation boils down to deceiving or putting pressure on a person. However, as Carl Jung argued, the essence of this phenomenon is much deeper. He concluded that true manipulation affects the subconscious level. It's not just about changing someone's opinion, but about transforming their perception of reality, even when they don't realize it. Jung called this phenomenon shadow projection, when the manipulator transfers their own unconscious motives to another person, forcing them to bear an emotional burden that rightfully belongs to the manipulator themselves. This creates what Jung called a psychic infection, when the manipulator's distorted reality becomes the reality of their victim. It is worth remembering the feeling of confusion, self-doubt, or an inexplicable sense of responsibility for other people's problems after a conversation. This feeling of disorientation does not arise by chance, but is a consequence of an encounter with a person who perfectly masters the art of psychological manipulation. If the reader recognizes their own experiences in this description, it is important for them to know the following. The ability to recognize this feeling indicates a developed emotional intelligence that is significantly higher than the average level. People who are completely insensitive to manipulation tend to have less developed empathy and are unable to feel what others feel. The paradox is that the higher a person's emotional intelligence, the more vulnerable they become to manipulation. Studies conducted at the Sorbonne show that people with developed emotional intelligence are more likely to trust others. This natural predisposition to sincere relationships creates a special vulnerability that manipulators exploit with surgical precision. In the modern world, where the flow of information overwhelms us like an unstoppable tsunami, a person's natural psychological barriers are gradually weakening. Social networks, these ubiquitous platforms of digital communication, have accustomed us to a superficial perception of information, which makes us more vulnerable than ever to manipulation techniques as old as the world. This is where Jung's teaching appears in all its revolutionary significance, opening our eyes to the hidden mechanisms of the human psyche. Most people, unfortunately, do not realize that these manipulative patterns stem from what Jung called the shadow of personality, the totality of rejected, repressed aspects of the self that act autonomously, often outside the manipulator's conscious control. This explains why many of those who skillfully weave webs of manipulation do not even recognize their actions. Their tactics seem natural to them, self-evident. Here are 5 phrases that act like a psychological X-ray, instantly exposing manipulators who have been lurking in the shadows of your life for years. The first phrase, "I'm just telling the truth." This seemingly harmless statement actually reveals a deeply ingrained manipulator strategy. Jung astutely observed that manipulators often skillfully mask their aggression under the guise of virtue, presenting their comments as some kind of truth. In doing so, they create an impenetrable shield against any possible reaction from the other person. What is really happening from a Jungian understanding of the shadow? The manipulator projects their own insecurity, their own complexes onto you. They use truth as a cover for making judgments, criticisms, and establishing control over the situation. When someone prefaces a hurtful statement with, "I'm just telling the truth," they are essentially saying, "You have no right to be upset about what I'm about to say." This creates a kind of double bind. If you dare to object, you will immediately be declared an enemy of truth. Consider how skillfully the manipulator presents themselves as a paragon of morality while simultaneously striking a blow to the self-esteem of their victim. It is worth being wary when such a phrase is heard in conversation and carefully analyzing the other person's subsequent words. Are they genuinely trying to help, or is their goal to humiliate and devalue? Carl Jung advised listening to your feelings after such conversations. Sincere criticism, even if unpleasant, does not leave you feeling hurt and lacking dignity, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is an even more sophisticated form of manipulation that encroaches on the very foundation of a person's perception of reality. This is gaslighting, a term that became widespread after Jung described the phenomenon in his works. Gaslighting is an attack on a person's ability to adequately assess reality. When someone says that you are overreacting to something, they are not simply criticizing your behavior, they are denying the validity of your feelings and emotions. Jung argued that emotions are important signals that our subconscious sends us to tell us about our experience. By rejecting a person's emotional response, the manipulator tries to deprive them of their connection with their own intuition and inner compass. The phrase is made particularly sinister by the shifting of responsibility, when the focus shifts from the manipulator's actions to the victim's reaction. This is a prime example of Jungian projection, when a person who is unable to cope with their emotions transfers them to another person. The next time you hear an accusation of overreacting, it is important to remember that healthy people openly discuss problems without questioning the right to their existence. Moving on to the third phrase, we enter the realm that Jung would call secret deals, where noble deeds turn into hidden weapons. This manifests as a martyr complex, where a person keeps a secret record of good deeds, demanding unconditional obedience in return. True generosity, as Jung taught, is selfless and requires nothing in return. When a person begins to list their good deeds, it ceases to be kindness in principle. The underlying mechanisms of manipulation are often hidden from view, where past actions, presented as acts of generosity, become an instrument for creating an unpaid debt. The manipulator skillfully creates a tacit agreement in which personal freedom becomes the price. Healthy relationships are characterized by a spirit of reciprocity, not a scrupulous calculation of services rendered. Constant reminders of a favor done reveal a mercantile view of relationships, which Carl Jung would regard as a manifestation of immaturity and unconsciousness. Moving on to the fourth phrase, we find a shift from manipulating the past to a more insidious tactic, distorting the very concept of responsibility. It's like looking at the Matrix, where the hidden code is revealed behind the manipulator's appearance of reality. This tactic exposes an underdeveloped ego, unable to acknowledge responsibility for its own emotions and actions. By shifting the blame for their feelings or actions onto another person, the manipulator avoids taking personal responsibility. The bitter truth is revealed, which not all psychologists are quick to voice. No one has power over another person's feelings. Emotions are a response, formed by individual psychology, personal history, and subconscious attitudes. Accusation of experiencing emotions is indicative of psychological immaturity, which Jung identified a century ago. Moreover, it is an attempt to establish control by placing responsibility for the manipulator's emotional state on another person. An impossible burden is created when one has to manage not only one's own emotions, but also those of others. This is pure emotional manipulation, radically different from expressions of sincere love. According to Jung, the concluding phrase, "If you really loved me, you would," represents the most dangerous form of psychological violence. In 2023, a large-scale study conducted by researchers at the University of Paris, encompassing 3,000 instances of domestic violence, revealed a striking pattern. In 91% of cases, victims reported the use of the same insidious phrase. This linguistic pattern, as Jung astutely observed, is a prime example of emotional blackmail, the cynical use of close relationships as a weapon. This is not simply about controlling behavior, but about encroaching upon a person's very identity, dictating how love should be expressed. The manipulator shamelessly oversteps the boundaries of the individual, distorting their autonomy and right to self-determination. The true danger of this phrase lies in its ability to turn a person's best qualities into shackles. The victim is forced into a false choice, either abandon their own principles and needs or admit their inability to love. This is a direct attack on the process of individuation, which Jung considered an inherent right of every person, the right to become a complete and harmonious individual. When someone resorts to such a phrase, they are not asking for love, they are demanding unconditional obedience. Take a moment to pause and reflect on recent conversations. How often has this phrase been uttered, and who were the speakers? The key discovery, capable of changing one's perception of the situation, is this: manipulation is not a character trait, it is a distinct language. Just as one can master French or Spanish, it is possible to become bilingual in recognizing manipulations. Once this skill is acquired, no one will be able to use this language unnoticed. This is the insight that Jung had, but unfortunately it remains underestimated by many psychologists. Such schemes are not merely isolated behavioral acts, but a holistic symbolic system designed to bypass conscious perception and penetrate the subconscious. Imagine the ability to penetrate the essence of human utterances with a gaze, like an X-ray machine, revealing hidden motives and true intentions. Gaining such awareness is akin to taking the red pill from the Matrix when the veil of illusion falls away and the true code of reality is revealed. However, genuine transformation occurs not simply at the moment of recognizing manipulative phrases, but in the changes that take place in the mind and body. Confusion is replaced by clarity, doubts give way to confidence, and most importantly, the individual regains their lost power. The author shares personal experiences, admitting to being an unwitting victim of manipulation for many years, despite having a background in psychology. Discovering Jung's protocol was a turning point, allowing the author to break this vicious cycle. Specific steps are suggested that can be taken immediately. The first step is to implement Jung's concept of maintaining tension between opposites. When confronted with one of the 5 manipulative phrases, instead of reacting aggressively or submitting, calmly state, "I notice that you are saying," verbatim repeating the manipulator's phrase, but without responding to the substance of it. This simple trick disrupts the entire manipulation scheme. The second step involves turning to the wisdom of the body. Manipulation can paralyze the mind, but the body always senses the truth. It is recommended to place a hand on the chest, take a deep breath and listen to the sensations: tension, discomfort in the abdomen, or a feeling of heaviness. These are all signals from the psychological immune system, warning of manipulation, even if the words seem perfectly reasonable. The third step is to utter the phrase, "I need to think about what you said. I suggest we pause the conversation." These words become kryptonite for manipulators, as they thwart their plans and prevent them from violating personal boundaries. When the author first applied the described methods, the manipulator in their life showed clear irritation, which was a revelation. Rejecting manipulation inevitably reveals the hidden motives behind such phrases. It is important to remember that manipulations thrive in conditions of confusion and haste. Any actions aimed at clarifying and slowing down the course of events weaken their impact. Jung realized that manipulation is not only a desire to control others, but also a way to avoid facing undesirable aspects of one's own personality. By manipulating, a person tries to escape their own vulnerability, insecurity, and fear. That is why the best defense against manipulation is not just a set of techniques, but deep self-knowledge. The more a person is aware of their true essence, the less susceptible they are to the influence of those who seek to distort it. In conclusion of this analysis, it is important to pay attention to one key point. The 5 phrases that unmask manipulators are not just words, they are visible manifestations of a hidden psychological virus that Jung identified long before modern psychology could understand it. The author was struck not so much by the frequency with which these phrases were used, but by the fact that many people he respected had used them against him throughout his life. The author invites readers to write "shadow of consciousness" in the comments if they have heard these phrases from loved ones. Readers will be surprised by how many people share this experience. Manipulators will not disappear from life overnight, but susceptibility to them can disappear today, and that is of paramount importance. It is likely that if the above resonated with you, it is because you have personally encountered similar situations. It is important to realize that you are not alone in your experiences, and most importantly, that you are not to blame for what happened. Skillful manipulations achieve their goal precisely because people with kind hearts and pure intentions do not expect deception and are not prepared for it. However, now that the truth has been revealed, the situation changes dramatically. Do not keep this knowledge to yourself. Share this information with those who may need it right now, before they have to face a manipulator in their lives again. Perhaps this act will be the most important thing you do today for a loved one. In the next installment, we will turn to Jung's plan for shadow integration, a complex psychological process that can make you invulnerable to manipulation and radically change your relationships with others. In the meantime, let us recall the words of the great psychologist Carl Jung. Your intuition is able to recognize the truth even when the mind is still trying to make sense of what is happening. Trust your inner voice, and it will not let you